a history of the linguistic act, or linguistic gesture, whatever you want to call it, which is characterized by two things. First of all, it is an evolutionary history. It tells us that at the beginning, of course, was language. At the beginning was the word. It was not the written word. Dilip mentioned the written. At the beginning is orality. Orality made flesh and all that. Writing was not there at the beginning. It only came later. What was there at the beginning was what we can call verbal art. And I say verbal art. And I could see it. I mean, my father worked in town, but he had a farm in a rural area. And he was very committed to the people in that area where he had his farm. And very often, on matters of concern, political matters concerning that community, they would bring people together, and people would speak and deliberate in public. And I attended, children are there, everybody is there, I mean, chickens, dogs, there's no separation. Everybody is there. It's a performance. How is it that you speak in public? How do you argue a case? How do you persuade others? Because you have to persuade others. And the very first function of language is, of course, exchange, communication, but it's persuasion. Persuasion, the arts of persuasion are at the foundational origins of language. We use language in order to carry with you those who, at the beginning, were not in agreement with you, but you have managed to draw them to you, to your opinion. And there are whole sets of rhetorical strategies to achieve that, in which reason, of course, is important, but so is performance. The use of proverbs, imagery, all of that. Language in action, in situ. So, all of this, of course, is codified. Language becomes spectacle. The spectacular character of language is, in this context, what gives it life. If you lose that, then that language becomes purely prosaic. So it seems to me that in this context, of course, if we take it like that, there are a number of questions we can ask. But going back to the Judeo-Christian mythology, the other thing it tells us is that at the beginning there was one language. Remember that story of Babel? People spoke one common language. And then they undertook to build this tower, and something happened, they couldn't agree with each other, and then started speaking multiple languages. That monolingualism somewhat, the idea that monolingualism might be the best means of communication, and that in the post-Babylonian age, there's only confusion, there's no communication. But where I grew up, my own experience, and the experience of many, at least in the rest of the continent, is that monolingualism is a farce. If you only speak one language, you look really stupid. There's no other way to put it. You cannot survive in Kinshasa, in Lagos, in Abidjan, in Dakar, or in Douala if you only speak one language. You just float over the real. In order to go deep in the real, you have to be able to live in a post-Babylonian condition even more. And when I say post-Babylonian, I don't mean the kind of multiculturalism of languages we see in some places where the constitution says, okay, we have 13 languages, but they do not communicate among each other. They live separately. It's not that. The post-Babylonian condition, at least in urban West Africa, is a condition in which many different languages keep trafficking on each other. French is trafficking on Wolof, on Arabic, and all of that, as a fact of life. It's not within institutions. It's in the everyday life of the people. You go to the market, you catch a taxi, you talk to whoever is in front of you. So this question of monolingualism, then, I think is something that I think doesn't really characterize life there. Now, let me make two other comments and then move on, and then end. The third comment has to do with the biography of languages, in the sense that, you know, on a long durée perspective, we have to accept that languages are born and then they die. The question of the death of languages. And today, people like Ngugi, a number of others, are preoccupied by this idea of the death of languages, almost in the same way as we are preoccupied with the death of certain species. So this speciation of language, the fact that we are in an age when language is more or less similar to species, disappearing, vanishing species, is something of discussion, of course, some of us have been having with Ngugi. The discussion is the following. First of all, it's a historical process that languages die and others are born. And to some extent, of course, there is a price to pay for that. Who pays that price? These are things we have to sort out. It has a price. We cannot deny that. But nor can we be too dramatic about that. I'm not saying to be cynical about it, because of course the price is always somewhat the death of a word. But it's not the death of a library, to use a term used in West Africa, that each language is like a library, and its death is the death of a library. Of course, you know what happens is that people keep speaking, even when a language has died. It doesn't mean the end of human capacity to speak, to articulate thought of a deep nature. It doesn't mean that. So maybe that might help us to dramatize this question. One last point. It's about the decolonization of knowledge. Of course, Dilip made it clear that discussion was from within that context. I think that decolonizing knowledge is inseparable from decommissioning certain knowledges. Decolonization cannot go without decommissioning. Decommissioning meaning parting ways with that which is no longer, that which has passed its cell date, as anthropologist Gassan Haj was teaching us a year ago. So this question of decolonization as a way of decommissioning that which has passed its cell date applies to knowledges too, and to languages. It does apply to certain languages that have become to feel home languages. And in the world in which we live today, do not allow us to feel beyond our immediate environment. Because the big challenge, especially in South Africa, with all that we know, is to learn to feel beyond the confines of the boundaries of this society. We cannot have an approach to language, decolonization of language, whatever you want, that is nationalist. Decolonization means denationalization. And unless we apply these two things to the question of knowledge, institutions, and language, we will end up reproducing the parameters and the strictures of the kind of nativism which today seems to be the only real force against financial, the hegemony of finance capital. That the real forces against finance capital are the dark forces of nativism, xenophobia, and all that. So that's a really provocative set of statements. I hope that they don't derail.
Self-confessedly provocative statements.
So I ended there.
Actually, thank you, and I think Achille has raised three interesting issues. One is this issue of the pragmatic relation to language. We don't need to be angsting about, nor overawed by the idea that English is the master language and so on. That one has to have a language is what you can do with it. So whether it's English, French, Portuguese, whatever. Secondly, this question of where I think probably which needs a little more elaboration, where he speaks about the multilingualism of our spaces. In India, I grew up speaking 4 languages, and like he said, we've been taught in India we spoke only English. So, but what are we to do with this modes of cultural conversation, and how are we to think about what this multilingualism actually produces in terms of theorization, where there's a projection of that local articulation of multilingualism onto a more universal realm of argument. Those are some of the problems that we need to think about more seriously. And finally, I think this thing of denationalized, deterritorialized thinking, what does it mean to think with ideas of the global south? For us, the West is no longer a space. Marx is no longer a German thinker. Right? And there are Indian Marxists who think that Marx was born a Brahmin in India. I'm just joking. But there's a way in which these thinkers come without saying. They're so much a part of our landscape and apparatus and habitus that we just tend to, and so when would it happen that thinkers from the global south acquire this kind of status, and for us, more than for the West, right? And there is a larger question there. Eric?
Thanks. I wish I'd gone first rather than in this position, because in a way, a lot of what you've said and certainly what Gabriel said, what Achille said, are, I think, entailments of what I'd hoped to say. And indeed, what I hoped to start out by saying was that in your little blurb for this panel, it began with language, but then in the remaining text, you left language completely aside. And I suspect that my colleagues here noticed that, and that's why they took up precisely the question of language. What I wanted to do was to focus squarely on language, which they've started to do. And not so much to issue a warning as to identify a set of tensions that it seemed to be inherent in the project of decolonizing the university, but which are often not acknowledged or get kind of smuggled under the carpet. And they have to do with exactly many of the issues that you just listed, that you've just taken from Achille's talk. I'll try and crystallize them around a set of themes, and I'm going to sort of abandon my text here and try and do this extemporaneously. So one has to do with the relationship between language and being, or language and thought. A second has to do with the relationship between language and translation, in the sense it follows from the first. A third has to do with the relationship between language and identity, and of course has reference to issues around nationalism and placemaking and revisiting the kind of autochthony that people often imagine attends to every human person. And lastly, maybe something about this question of the tension between universalism and particularism, or what sometimes gets cast as cosmopolitanism versus localism. There are different kind of versions of this. Why? Why is this important when we think about the project of decolonizing the university? Well, because implicit often is that are a set of choices that are going to be made. Which language should be taught? Which languages should be read? what should be the languages that are authorized or revalued in the context of a space such as this one. So immediately, Gabriel's intervention destabilizes everything that one takes for granted. And there's Ali Mazrui reports on how he once went to the African Studies Association meetings in the US and stood at the podium and began to read his paper in Kiswahili. And of course, that just surfaced a set of implicit tensions that were already apparent, which is that most of the people attending the conference would have been equally, if not more comfortable, perhaps, one might say, speaking other languages, but in this arena they were asked to basically set that aside and allow the mastery of largely white American male scholars who owned the African Studies franchise, or did for a long time in the US, kind of created it, to kind of carry on in the terrain in which they were comfortable. So let's just, and I wanted to do this by going back and looking at the history of colonial linguistics. And this is something that the scholars of India, of course, know very well, and not least because that's where some of the great, really interesting work by people like Bernard Cohen has been undertaken. The colonial project is going to haunt the decolonizing project. That's what I want to focus on. So how? The colonial project involved the challenge of being able to engage in or acquire some degree of mastery over the languages of the native, right? A command over the over language in order to implement a language of command. That's Cohen's formulation of this problem. So what did it mean in practice? It meant that beginning with missionaries, but then also with various other kind of colonial professionals of colonial administrations, both in South Asia and in Africa, you had people who went out and decided which languages needed to be learned, how should they be, what should be the authorized orthographies in order to make them accessible to learners from outside the continent. How then could those orthographies generate a set of written text that could be that could circulate in ways that colonial authorities could control? How did the teaching of those languages then become part and parcel of the process of colonial authority and command and so forth? At every juncture, there were interlocutors, all of those people who often were around whom there was tremendous ambivalence, often cast as people who were speakers of impure intermediate languages, the Creoles, the Pidgins, the Fanagolos, all of that increasingly began to occupy the space in which the colonizer and the colonized interacted. So despite that, there was a strenuous effort to impose upon that complicated, messy, polluted field purity. And the purity was often with reference to language, original languages that had preceded the kind of mess that the colonists felt they had found, the project of philology, by engaging in a comparative study of Sanskrit or of Persian or whatever, that one could then identify what were the original languages to which one might be able to return in order to engage in a project of authorizing some and deauthorizing others. But it also then resulted in what we know now in Southern Africa as the reification of certain linguistic forms and their orthographies and their texts as ideal, not just ideal types, but the languages that are taught. There are wonderful examples of this, like Shona was created by a committee of missionaries, each of which belonged to a different denomination, and which got together in order to agree on a common orthography. And they actually constituted Shona as a language. You see the same thing in what's sometimes called the Ronga or the Tonga, that the Swiss missionaries also engaged in the creation of a language because they couldn't manage the diversity of linguistic forms and practices that they encountered on the ground. We are the inheritors of this, and I think what's already been drawn attention to is that to make decisions about which languages should now be taught is to essentially engage in a reproduction of that same reification, that same distillation of what are in fact often artifices of colonial practice and colonial rule. and that are therefore as saturated as anything else with the sorts of tools of